Before a single law was written, before a single badge was pinned, there was just land. And that land was enormous, stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the Pacific, mostly untouched, mostly unmapped. We're talking about a territory so massive that the entire eastern United States could fit inside it twice. Nobody owned it in any legal sense that mattered. Not yet. The year is 1803. Thomas Jefferson just bought 828,000 square miles of land from France for $15 million. That deal, the Louisiana Purchase, changed everything. Overnight, the United States doubled in size, and almost nobody living east of the Mississippi had any real idea what was out there. Jefferson sent two men to find out. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark left in the spring of 1804 with a crew of about 40 men. They traveled more than 8,000 miles over 2 years. What they found was staggering. Towering mountain ranges, rivers wider than anything back home, plains that seemed to go on forever. But they also found something else. People had already been living here for thousands of years. Hundreds of nations, hundreds of languages, hundreds of ways of life. The Comanche controlled a territory in present-day Texas, bigger than most European countries. The Lakota Sioux ruled the northern plains with absolute authority. These were not primitive people sitting in empty land waiting to be discovered. These were civilizations, complex, powerful, and deeply connected to the land. And then the Americans started moving west, slowly at first, then in waves. The Oregon Trail opened up in the early 1840s, and suddenly thousands of families were loading everything they owned into wagons and heading into the unknown. The journey was nearly 2,000 miles long. It took about 5 months. People died along the way, from cholera, from accidents, from starvation. Some turned back, most kept going, because the promise of land, free land, your own land, was something most of these people had never had before. That promise was more powerful than fear. Here's the thing nobody told them clearly enough: the land wasn't empty, and the people already there had no intention of leaving. What followed wasn't inevitable. It was a choice made over and over again by men in Washington who never set foot out there. The result was decades of violence that shaped everything about the West that came after. Then in January 1848, a man named James Marshall was inspecting a water channel at a sawmill near Coloma, California. He saw something glinting in the water. It was gold. 9 days later, Mexico officially signed over California to the United States. The timing was almost too perfect to believe. Word spread, slowly, then all at once. By 1849, more than 80,000 people had flooded into California. They came by ship around South America. They came overland through deserts that could kill a man in 3 days. They came because the word gold makes people do things that nothing else can. And here's what the gold rush actually built. Not wealth for most of the miners. Most of them went home broke. What it built was infrastructure, and towns, and roads, and a desperate need for some kind of order. Because when you put 80,000 men in one place, with nothing to lose and everything to gain, violence follows. There were no courts, there were no jails that mattered. There was only what a man could enforce with his own hands. And that single brutal fact, is where the story of the outlaw truly begins. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to become outlaws. It was a slow drift. One bad year, one wrong turn, one moment that couldn't be undone. To understand these men, you have to understand the world that made them. The Civil War ended in 1865, but for hundreds of thousands of men, the fighting never really stopped. The South was gutted. Farms were ash. Livestock was gone. Entire towns had been stripped to nothing. And the men who came home, if they came home, came back to rubble. Jesse James was 17 when he rode with Confederate guerrillas in Missouri. He was not yet a man, and he was already learning that a gun solved problems faster than words. When the war ended, men like Jesse were told to lay down their arms and go back to farming. But farming felt like surrender when the banks were foreclosing on your land, and the Union soldiers were still patrolling your roads. So some men kept the gun. It was the only trade they knew. Billy the Kid had a different story, and in some ways a sadder one. Born Henry McCarty, probably in New York City around 1859, he never had a father worth mentioning. His mother, Catherine, dragged him west, Kansas, Colorado, finally New Mexico, chasing something better that never quite arrived. She died of tuberculosis when Billy was 15. 15 years old, no family, no money, no land, in a territory where the law was whoever had the most guns. He stole a horse within a year. Not because he was born bad, because he was hungry. The frontier had a way of compressing a man's options down to almost nothing. Cole Younger grew up watching his father, a respected Missouri businessman, get murdered by Union militia in 1862. That wasn't war. That was a grudge killing with a flag attached to it. Cole was 18, his brothers were younger. The rage that grew out of that moment never fully left him. You see, most of these men didn't start as criminals. They started as casualties. The system failed them first, or worse, actively crushed them, and then called them outlaws when they pushed back. But here's where it gets more complicated. The railroads were the great villain of this story, and almost everyone in the West knew it. In the 1870s, railroad companies were swallowing land across Kansas, Missouri, and Texas, land that farmers had broken their backs to clear. The government had handed those companies millions of acres in land grants, and the companies turned around and sold it, or charged farmers rent to live on soil they thought they owned. When Jesse James robbed the Rock Island Railroad in Iowa in 1873, a lot of ordinary people cheered, not because robbery was admirable, but because the target felt deserved. The newspapers, especially the Kansas City Times, printed letters glorifying Jesse like he was Robin Hood with a Missouri drawl. He wasn't Robin Hood. He kept almost everything he stole, but the mythology stuck, because the anger underneath it was real. Then there was the sheer geography of the place. The Indian Territory was a patchwork of jurisdictions where U.S. law barely reached. Outlaws figured this out fast. Cross the right river and the marshal chasing you had to stop at the territorial line. The Dalton Gang, the Doolin Dalton outfit, Bell Star, all of them used Indian Territory as a base camp, a hideout, a place to breathe between jobs. Judge Isaac Parker in Fort Smith, Arkansas spent 21 years trying to impose order on that chaos. He hanged 86 men. He called it justice. His critics called it a war of attrition. He wasn't wrong, neither were they. That tension between a crumbling legal order and men who slipped through its cracks is what produced the outlaw era. Not wickedness, not some wild gene, circumstance, pressure, and a landscape so vast and so lawless that a man with nerve and a fast horse could simply disappear. Because once you crossed that line, once you robbed your first train or drew on your first man, the world divided into two kinds of people, those hunting you and those hiding you. And surviving in that world required something colder and smarter than most people gave these men credit for. Jesse James was not born an outlaw. He was born a farmer's son in Clay County, Missouri, on September 5, 1847. But the Civil War came, and it swallowed him whole before he was even 16 years old. His older brother Frank joined a Confederate guerrilla unit called Quantrill's Raiders. Jesse followed. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They burned towns, ambushed Union patrols, and executed prisoners in the open field. Jesse learned violence the way other boys learned to plow. By the time the war ended in 1865, he was 17 years old and already a killer. And the Union had no mercy for the men who fought like he did. Former guerrillas were not offered pardons or pensions. They were hunted. So Jesse James made a decision that would define the next 16 years of his life. He would not surrender to a world that had no place for him. He would take what he needed at gunpoint. On February 13, 1866, a gang rode into Liberty, Missouri, and robbed the Clay County Savings Bank. It was the first daylight bank robbery in American history during peacetime. Jesse was likely there, though history keeps the exact details murky. What is not murky is what came next. Over the following decade, the James Gang cut a violent streak across Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and Minnesota. They robbed banks, they robbed trains, they robbed stagecoaches, they killed anyone who got in the way. But here's the part that makes Jesse James different from every other outlaw of his era. The newspapers loved him. A journalist named John Newman Edwards, a former Confederate himself, began writing stories that painted Jesse James as a hero. He called him a Robin Hood of the plains, a man fighting back against northern oppression and and crooked railroad barons. It was propaganda. Almost none of it was true. The people Jesse robbed were often ordinary farmers and townspeople, not distant railroad executives. But the myth was more powerful than the truth, and it spread. Then came the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The railroads hired them specifically to destroy the James Gang. In January 1875, Pinkerton agents surrounded the James family farmhouse in Clay County. They threw an incendiary device through the window. It exploded inside. It killed Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother, Archie Samuel. It blew off the right arm of his mother, Zerelda. Jesse's mother, a one-armed woman, standing in the ruins of her own home. The public was outraged. Even people who had no sympathy for outlaws turned against the Pinkertons that night. Jesse James became a martyr without even being dead yet. He used that outrage brilliantly. He gave interviews. He wrote open letters to newspapers. He positioned himself as the wronged man, the victim of a corrupt system, and people believed him because they wanted to believe him. But inside the gang, things were fracturing. The Northfield, Minnesota bank raid in September 1876 nearly destroyed everything. Local citizens shot back, hard. 2 gang members were killed in the streets. 3 younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, were captured, bleeding and broken in a swamp. Jesse and Frank barely escaped into the wilderness. For 3 years after Northfield, Jesse James almost disappeared. He lived under a false name. He moved his family from city to city. He called himself Thomas Howard, a quiet man with a wife and 2 children, living in a rented house in St. Joseph, Missouri. But Jesse James could not stay quiet forever. He reformed the gang. He started robbing again. And this time the men around him were not loyal old war brothers. They were hired guns, strangers, men who could be bought. One of them was a 20-year-old named Robert Ford. Jesse trusted him. He let Ford into his home, ate meals with him, gave him a place to sleep. On the morning of April 3, 1882, Jesse James climbed onto a chair to straighten a picture frame on the wall. He had taken off his gun belt, so no one passing the window would recognize him. Robert Ford drew his revolver. He shot Jesse James in the back of the head. Jesse was 34 years old. He fell to the floor of his own home, in front of his wife and children, in a house nobody was supposed to know he lived in. Robert Ford collected the reward money and became famous overnight, but not in the way he hoped. Crowds called him a coward, a traitor, the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard. Songs were written about it within weeks, because Jesse James was more powerful as a dead man than he ever was alive. The legend sealed the moment the bullet entered his skull. And somewhere underneath all of that legend, underneath the newspaper stories and the folk songs and the myth, there is still a real question that historians argue about to this day. Was Jesse James a freedom fighter, or was he simply a violent man who was very good at making people forget that? If Jesse James was a man who chose violence, Billy the Kid was a boy it chose first. He was born William Henry McCarty Jr., probably in New York City, around 1859. Nobody knows exactly when, nobody knows exactly where, and that mystery followed him his whole short life. His mother, Catherine McCarty, was a tough Irish immigrant who refused to sit still. She packed up her 2 boys and moved west, chasing dry air and a second chance. Kansas, then Colorado, then New Mexico. She was always moving, always searching. She landed in Silver City, New Mexico, in 1873, and for a moment it looked like the family might actually make it. She met a man named William Antrim, married him, and tried to build something real. But then she got tuberculosis, and in September 1874, Catherine McCarty was gone. Billy was 15 years old, and he had nobody. His stepfather handed him off and walked away. So Billy did what boys with nobody do. He started running. He drifted into the wrong crowd almost immediately, a scrappy teenager in a territory where law was mostly suggestion. In August 1877, at a camp near Fort Grant, Arizona, a bully named Frank Windy Cahill grabbed Billy, threw him to the ground, and pinned him. Billy pulled a gun and shot him dead. He was 17 years old. He fled into New Mexico territory, and that is where his legend truly begins. Billy had found work on a ranch owned by an English cattle baron named John Tunstall. Tunstall was young, fair, and actually kind to Billy, maybe the first employer who ever treated him like a person. He was the only man who ever treated me like I mattered, Billy reportedly said. But New Mexico in 1878 was boiling. A brutal business war was building between two factions fighting over the county's beef contracts and almost everything else. On one side, Tunstall and a lawyer named Alexander McSween. On the other, a corrupt merchant ring backed by the county sheriff, a man named William Brady. On February 18, 1878, a posse working for the rival faction rode out and shot John Tunstall dead, execution style, in an open field. Billy watched it happen. Something snapped in him that day that never came back. He joined a group called the Regulators, a posse that claimed to be pursuing legal justice for Tunstall's murder. What it became was something more personal, a vendetta. On April 1, 1878, the Regulators ambushed Sheriff William Brady on the main street of Lincoln, New Mexico. Brady and a deputy fell dead in the dirt. Billy was in the middle of it all. The Lincoln County War exploded from there. Raids, ambushes, cattle theft, more bodies. It climaxed in a 5-day battle in July 1878, with Billy and the McSween faction trapped inside a burning house, bullets coming through every window. When the fire got too hot, Billy ran out into the darkness, guns blazing. He survived. McSween did not. After that, the war was over, but Billy had nowhere to go and was wanted for murder. He tried to negotiate a deal with New Mexico's governor, Lew Wallace. Yes, the same Lew Wallace who was writing Ben-Hur at the time. Wallace promised Billy a pardon if he testified against other killers in the county. Billy held up his end of the deal. Wallace did not. Betrayed again, Billy went back to what he knew: rustling cattle, drifting, surviving on instinct and speed. By 1880, a new sheriff named Pat Garrett had one mission: bring in Billy the Kid. Garrett was smart, patient, and he knew Billy personally. They had once been friends. That made him more dangerous, not less. In December 1880, Garrett tracked Billy to a ranch at Stinking Springs, New Mexico, and captured him after a brief standoff. Billy was tried, convicted of Sheriff Brady's murder, and sentenced to hang. But Billy the Kid was not built for cages. On April 28, 1881, inside the Lincoln County Courthouse, Billy got hold of a gun, nobody is completely sure how, and killed 2 deputies. He walked out into the afternoon sun, mounted a horse, and disappeared. The whole territory held its breath. Pat Garrett hunted him for 2.5 months across burning desert and empty range. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett slipped into a darkened bedroom at Fort Sumner and waited. Billy walked in, sensed something wrong, whispered, "PNS, who is it?" Garrett fired twice. Billy the Kid was dead at 21 years old. 21 years old and already the subject of dime novels, newspaper headlines, and myths so thick it buried the truth. He killed 8 men, or 4, depending on which account you believe. He was a cold-blooded killer, or a loyal friend betrayed by everyone who should have protected him. Maybe both things are true. What is certain is this: the West made Billy the Kid possible, a place with no safety net, no second chances, no one coming to save you. It manufactured boys like him by the dozen. He just happened to be the one we remember. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, and the West would never be the same. A single iron line now connected the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, stretching nearly 2,000 miles across open prairie and mountain passes. What took a wagon train 6 brutal months now took 6 days in a cushioned rail car. Towns that had been frontier outposts suddenly became cities, almost overnight. Cheyenne, Wyoming, went from a tent camp to a city of 6,000 people in less than a year. They called it Hell on Wheels, a roving city of saloons, gamblers, and prostitutes that followed the railroad workers west. But here is where it gets complicated. The railroad brought law, but it also brought desperation. It carved up the open range that cattle ranchers had ridden freely for decades. It put the old cattle trails out of business, one by one. Cowboys who had spent their whole lives driving longhorns up from Texas found their skills suddenly worthless. And the railroad made one thing crystal clear: whoever controlled the lines controlled the money. That truth was not lost on a generation of men who had nothing left to lose. The James Younger gang had already figured this out back in 1866. Jesse James and his brother Frank had spent the Civil War riding with Bloody Bill Anderson, a Confederate guerrilla so violent even his own side feared him. When the war ended, Jesse didn't know how to be anything except dangerous. On July 21, 1873, the gang rode to a remote stretch of track outside Adair, Iowa, and used a rope to pull a rail loose from the ties. The locomotive hit the gap at full speed and flipped into a ditch. The engineer, John Rafferty, was scalded to death by the escaping steam. Jesse and the boys walked through the wreckage and robbed the passengers at gunpoint. They took around $3,000, a good haul, but that wasn't really the point. The point was the message. The railroad does not own the West. Newspapers across the country printed the story, and something strange happened. Thousands of ordinary people cheered, because the railroad companies were not exactly beloved. Men like Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt had built their empires by buying politicians, fixing rates, and squeezing small farmers off their land. A farmer in Missouri might lose his homestead because the railroad jacked up freight prices he couldn't afford. Jesse James, to those people, looked a little like Justice. He was Robin Hood with a revolver, or at least that's the story the newspaper sold. The reality, of course, was uglier. The people Jesse actually robbed were clerks and conductors and working passengers, not railroad executives. But myth is more powerful than reality, and in the 1870s, Jesse James was the most famous outlaw alive. The railroads hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to stop him. Alan Pinkerton had built his agency into the most feared private law enforcement operation in America. His agents had shadowed Confederate spies during the war and broken labor strikes for the coal companies. While they were chasing Jesse James through the Missouri hills, and they were losing. In January 1875, Pinkerton agents surrounded the James family farmhouse in Kearney, Missouri. They threw an incendiary device through the window. Some accounts say it was a bomb, others say a flare. It exploded inside the kitchen. Jesse's 8-year-old half-brother Archie Samuel was killed. His mother Zerelda lost her right hand. Jesse was nowhere near the house that night. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Missouri's state legislature nearly passed a bill granting Jesse James a formal amnesty. The Pinkertons had turned a wanted criminal into a martyr overnight. Jesse understood exactly what he was now, and he used it. For the next 7 years, the robberies continued. Banks in Kentucky, stagecoaches in Texas, trains in Minnesota. Wherever the money moved, Jesse followed. But the railroad kept expanding, and with it came something no outlaw could charm or shoot his way out of. Telegraph lines now ran beside every track, carrying news of a robbery faster than any horse could ride. Sheriffs in 3 states could be coordinating a manhunt within hours of a crime. The open frontier that had given outlaws room to breathe was quietly being fenced in, wire by wire, mile by mile. The age of the railroad had arrived, and it was slowly, methodically strangling the age of the outlaw. Jesse James just didn't know it yet. By the turn of the century, the age of the outlaw was dying. The railroads had laced the land together. Sheriffs had telegraphs, and the Pinkertons had files on every wanted man in America. But one gang refused to read the obituary. They called themselves the Wild Bunch, and at their center stood a man named Robert Leroy Parker, though the world would remember him as Butch Cassidy. Cassidy was born in 1866 in Beaver, Utah, the oldest of 13 children in a Mormon farming family. His father worked the land and expected his son to do the same. But Robert Parker had other ideas. By his late teens, he was riding for cattle outfits across Wyoming and Colorado, learning the land, learning the men, learning which rules were worth keeping. He took the name Butch Cassidy somewhere along the way, Butch from a brief and glorious stretch as a butcher, Cassidy from a cowboy he admired. He robbed his first bank in Telluride, Colorado in 1889. He and 3 others walked out with around $21,000. Nobody got killed. That mattered to Butch. He had a rule, almost an obsession, about not shooting people if he could possibly avoid it. For a man in his profession, that was genuinely unusual. After Telluride, his reputation grew fast. He spent 18 months in the Wyoming State Penitentiary in the mid-1890s for horse theft, a charge he always claimed was bogus. When the governor offered him a pardon in exchange for a promise to go straight, Cassidy reportedly grinned and said he couldn't quite make that promise inside Wyoming. The pardon came anyway. He was back to work within a year. The outfit he built, the Wild Bunch, was the last great outlaw gang of the American West. They used a remote canyon in Wyoming called Hole in the Wall as their hideout, a narrow red rock pass so defensible that a handful of men could hold off an army. The Pinkertons knew the name but couldn't reach them. Riding with Cassidy was Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, a lean, cold-eyed gunfighter from Pennsylvania, who was everything Butch was not. Where Cassidy charmed, Sundance threatened. Where Cassidy joked, Sundance watched the door. Together they were remarkably effective. Between 1896 and 1901, the Wild Bunch robbed banks and trains across Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and New Mexico. The Wilcox train robbery in 1899 was their masterpiece. They stopped a Union Pacific Express near Medicine Bow, separated the express car, blew the safe with so much dynamite the car itself disintegrated, and rode off with roughly $30,000. The railroad men found pieces of the car 100 yards away. Union Pacific was furious. They hired the Pinkertons, and the Pinkertons came with everything they had. A special team, sometimes called the Super Posse, was put together specifically to hunt the Wild Bunch. They followed the gang across 5 states. They never quite caught them, but they never stopped either. And Cassidy, as smart as he was, could feel the walls closing in. In 1901, he made a decision that no American outlaw had ever really made before. He ran, not to another state, not to another territory, but to South America. He and Sundance, along with Sundance's companion Etta Place, booked passage to Argentina. They tried ranching in Patagonia of all things. Wide open land, no Pinkertons, nobody who knew their names. For a few years, it actually worked. They were almost ordinary, but old habits are hard to kill. By 1905, they were robbing banks in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Etta Place eventually vanished from the record entirely. No one knows why or where. And in November 1908, in a small Bolivian village called San Vicente, Bolivian soldiers surrounded 2 foreign bandits who had just robbed a mining payroll. A gunfight erupted. By morning, both men were dead. The Bolivians identified them as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Except, and here's where it gets strange, several people who knew Cassidy personally claimed to have met him years later, back in the United States, very much alive. His sister claimed he visited her in the 1920s. A childhood friend said the same. No grave in San Vicente has ever been conclusively proven to hold his remains. To this day, nobody knows for certain whether Butch Cassidy died in that Bolivian courtyard, or simply rode off one last time into a world that had finally stopped looking for him. They called it the Outlaw Trail, 1,000 miles of broken country stretching from Montana down to Mexico. And almost every story told about it puts a man at the center. But here's what the history books quietly left out. Women wrote it too. Not always by choice, but once they were in, many of them never looked back. The first name you need to know is Laura Bullion. Born in 1876 in Knickerbocker, Texas, she came from outlaws on both sides of her family. Her father was a horse thief. Her uncle rode with the notorious Hole in the Wall gang. By the time she was a teenager, the outlaw world wasn't a choice. It was just the water she swam in. She eventually linked up with the Wild Bunch, the same crew running with Butch Cassidy. And she didn't just cook their meals and stay quiet. Laura Bullion rode on jobs. She carried stolen goods across state lines. She forged documents. When the Winnemucca bank job money ran hot, Laura was the one moving it. In 1901, she was arrested in St. Louis with nearly $7,000 in stolen banknotes stuffed in her clothing. She served 5 years in federal prison and never gave up a single name, not one. That loyalty in the outlaw world was worth more than gold. But Laura Bullion is barely a footnote in most Western histories. She deserved a chapter of her own. Now move your mind north, up to the raw high country of Wyoming, because there was a ranch there, tucked against the Owl Creek Mountains, that doesn't appear on any tourist map. And a woman named Ann Bassett ran it like a queen. Born in 1878 in Browns Park, Colorado, right on the edge of the Utah and Wyoming border, Ann grew up surrounded by outlaws, the way other kids grew up surrounded by neighbors. Butch Cassidy himself used her family's ranch as a stopping point. She knew him personally. Some historians believe they were romantically involved. What's documented is this. Ann Bassett spent years locked in a war with the big cattle barons who were swallowing up the range. When they tried to push small ranchers out, Anne pushed back, hard. She was accused of rustling cattle from the very men who were trying to destroy her family's land. She went to trial twice. The jury couldn't convict her. Twice. The cattle barons called her dangerous. Her neighbors called her brave. She called herself a survivor. And she lived to 78, long enough to write her own memoir, on her own terms. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. These women didn't stumble into the outlaw world by accident. Most of them were born into a society that gave them almost no legal rights. They couldn't own property in most states without a husband's signature. They couldn't vote. They had almost no recourse if a man wronged them. The outlaw trail, twisted as it was, offered something the law didn't: agency. Now, there is one name that history did remember, but almost always got wrong: Belle Starr. They called her the Bandit Queen. The dime novels painted her as a pistol-cracking seductress who led gangs across Oklahoma. The real Belle Starr was more complicated, and honestly more interesting, than any of that. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley in 1848 in Carthage, Missouri, she grew up educated, playing piano, reading Latin. Her world cracked apart during the Civil War, when guerrilla violence tore through Missouri. Her brother was killed. She never fully came back from that. She married into outlaw circles, first linked to the James Younger Gang, then to a Creek outlaw named Sam Starr, on Indian Territory land. She was convicted of horse theft in 1883, the first woman tried for that crime by Judge Isaac Parker, the famous hanging judge of Fort Smith. She served 9 months. Then she went right back to Oklahoma. In February 1889, Belle Starr was shot from behind on a road near her home, 2 days before her 41st birthday. The killer was never identified. Her daughter Pearl blamed a neighbor. Others pointed at her own son. To this day, nobody knows who pulled that trigger. And somehow, in death, Belle Starr became bigger than she ever was in life. The dime novelists finished what the bullet started. They turned a complicated, grieving, land-defending woman into a cartoon. And the real story got buried under the myth. Just like almost every other woman on the outlaw trail, they didn't wear white hats to signal their goodness. Most of them had been on the wrong side of the law at least once. That's what made them so dangerous, because they knew exactly how outlaws thought. The men hired to bring order to the American West were in many ways mirrors of the men they hunted, and the line between the two was thinner than most history books admit. Take Wyatt Earp. By 1880, he had already been a horse thief suspect, a buffalo hunter, and a brothel bouncer. He was also the most feared lawman in Dodge City, Kansas. 6 feet tall, ice cold under pressure, and almost never the first to draw. He understood something most men didn't, that reputation was its own weapon. Half the outlaws who backed down from Wyatt Earp did it because of a story they'd heard, not a gun they'd seen. But reputation alone didn't stop the cowboys. In Tombstone, Arizona Territory, a loosely organized gang of rustlers and killers, known as the Cowboys, had been terrorizing the region for years. They stole cattle from Mexico, smuggled whiskey, and murdered anyone who pushed back. And they had friends, judges, politicians, and lawmen on their payroll. Wyatt brought his brothers Virgil and Morgan to Tombstone, and together they tried to hold the line. What happened next became the most famous 30 seconds in the history of the American West. October 26, 1881, the gunfight at the OK Corral lasted roughly 30 seconds, and left 3 men dead. It solved almost nothing. Within months, Morgan Earp was shot dead through a billiard hall window. Virgil was ambushed and left crippled for life, and Wyatt, consumed by grief and rage, rode out on what he called the vendetta ride, hunting down every man responsible. He killed at least 3, maybe more. No badge, no warrant, just fury with a 6-shooter. Then there was Pat Garrett, tall, quiet, methodical, a former buffalo hunter turned lawman in Lincoln County, New Mexico. He was hired for one reason, to stop Billy the Kid. Garrett and Billy had actually been friends once, drinking and gambling in the same saloons. That friendship ended when Garrett pinned on a badge. He tracked Billy for months, through some of the most unforgiving desert in North America. In December 1880, he cornered Billy's gang at Stinking Springs, a crumbling stone building barely big enough to shelter horses. Billy's men were starving and frostbitten. They surrendered without a fight. Billy was convicted and sentenced to hang. He escaped anyway, killing 2 deputies in the process. Garrett hunted him again. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett sat in the darkened bedroom of a ranch house at Fort Sumner, waiting. Billy walked in, didn't see him, and Garrett fired twice. The kid was 21 years old. Not every lawman worked alone. The Texas Rangers were something else entirely. Founded in 1835, they operated without courthouses, without jails, and sometimes without mercy. They crossed into Mexico when they felt like it, bent laws they disagreed with, and answered to almost no one. Captain Leander McNally led a ranger company so aggressive that the Mexican government formally complained to Washington about them. McNally was dying of tuberculosis the entire time, coughing blood between raids. He didn't slow down until his body gave out completely. What drove men like this? Some were true believers, convinced they were civilizing a savage land. Some were opportunists who found that a badge paid better than cattle work. And some were simply men who liked the violence and found a legal framework for it. The West didn't produce heroes and villains in neat categories. It produced men shaped by chaos, doing whatever the chaos required. And sometimes the most lawless thing a man could do was pin on a star and start enforcing his own definition of order. By the time the guns fell silent, the myth-making had already begun. The ink was barely dry on the wanted posters when the printing presses started spinning a very different story. Here's the thing about legends. They are not built from truth. They are built from what people want to be true. And in the years after the Civil War, Americans desperately wanted heroes. The country was exhausted, broken, and hungry for something to believe in. So the publishing houses of New York decided to give it to them. The weapon they used was something called the dime novel. 10 cents. That was all it cost. A thin paperback, maybe 100 pages, printed on the cheapest paper money could buy. But inside those cheap pages lived the most dangerous idea in American history. The idea that an outlaw could be a hero. The man who did more than anyone to build this myth was a writer named Ned Buntline. His real name was Edward Judson, and he was a con man, a drunk, and a genius. In 1869, Buntline traveled to Fort McPherson, Nebraska looking for a story. He found a 23-year-old Army scout named William Cody. Cody was good-looking, funny, and absolutely nobody had ever heard of him. Within a year, Buntline had written 4 serialized stories about him. He gave him a nickname, Buffalo Bill. And just like that, a legend was born, not in the West, but in a Manhattan office. Cody himself played along. He understood something most people did not. The story was more powerful than the man, but Buffalo Bill was just the beginning. The writers turned next to a man who was actively robbing banks and killing people at the time they were writing about him. Jesse James was not retired. He was not reformed. In 1874, while Jesse was still leading raids across Missouri and Kansas, a journalist named John Newman Edwards published a letter. Edwards was a former Confederate officer who never accepted the war's outcome. And in that letter, he cast Jesse James not as a criminal, but as a freedom fighter, a man pushed to violence by Yankee oppression. It was complete fiction dressed as political commentary, but it landed like a match on dry grass. Within months, dime novels were selling Jesse James as a Robin Hood of the prairies. There is just one problem with that story. Jesse James never gave a single dollar to the poor, not once, not ever. The people he robbed were often ordinary farmers and travelers, people not much different from himself. But the truth was not selling papers. The myth was, Billy the Kid got the same treatment, only faster. He was dead at 21, killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett in July 1881. Within 4 months of his death, a book appeared. It was called The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. It was written by Pat Garrett himself, or rather by a ghostwriter Garrett hired. And it painted Billy not as the violent young man he largely was, but as a tragic, almost romantic figure. Garrett needed the money, and a dead legend was more valuable than a dead criminal. The book sold. Then came the stage plays, the traveling shows, the illustrated weekly serials. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show opened in 1883 and toured the entire country. Sitting Bull joined for a season. Annie Oakley shot cigarettes out of men's mouths to thunderous applause. Millions of Americans, people who had never been west of the Mississippi, watched and believed. They believed the West was a place of simple moral choices. Good men, bad men, fast draws, and clean justice. None of it was true, of course. The real West was messy and brutal and deeply unfair. But the myth had taken root now, deep in the American imagination. And once a myth that good gets inside a culture, it does not leave easily. It shapes laws, shapes heroes, shapes the stories a nation tells about itself. We are still living inside the story those cheap 10-cent novels built. By 1900, the Wild West was already dying, not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet surrender to fences and railroads and law. The last real outlaws weren't romantic figures on horseback, they were desperate men running out of places to hide. And the man who proved it was a small-time horse thief named Bill Doolin, already dead by 1896, shot down by Marshal Heck Thomas outside Lawton, Oklahoma. His gang had scattered like smoke, some to prison, some to graves, some to ordinary lives nobody ever wrote dime novels about. But the myth refused to die as fast as the men. Even as Doolin's body was still warm, newspapers were already turning him into a legend he never quite earned in life. That is the cruel joke in the heart of this story. The West didn't end clean, it ended in pieces, one small surrender at a time, until one day there was simply nothing left to surrender. The moment most historians point to is September 5, 1901, the day President William McKinley was shot at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. It has nothing to do with cowboys, you might think, but McKinley's death and the sudden rise of Theodore Roosevelt set America on a course that made the old frontier mythology permanent, sealed in amber, forever. Roosevelt himself had lived in the Dakota Badlands as a rancher in the 1880s, carrying a rifle, rounding up cattle. He had once personally captured 3 armed outlaws and marched them 40 miles through blizzard conditions to the nearest jail. He was the last president who had actually lived the life the dime novels described. And once he reached the White House, he made the frontier something sacred, something to be remembered, not lived. Out in the territories, the last gunfighters were already adapting or dying. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had robbed their final American train on July 3, 1901, at Wagner, Montana. Pinkerton detectives had been chasing them across 3 states for years by then, and Butch knew the game was almost over. So they did something no dime novel ever predicted. They bought tickets. On February 20th, 1902, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid sailed from New York Harbor on the SS Herminius, bound for Argentina. Not a dramatic last stand in some canyon, just 2 tired men on a boat, leaving. They tried ranching in Patagonia, of all places, raising cattle in the Argentinian wilderness, living quietly under fake names. For a few years it almost worked, but old habits found them again, and by 1908, after a series of Bolivian bank and payroll robberies, they were cornered in the village of San Vicente on November 4th. Bolivian soldiers surrounded the building where they were hiding. What happened next has never been fully confirmed. The official Bolivian report says both men were found dead inside, one shot through the head, the other through the temple, the final bullet apparently self-inflicted. But no photographs were taken. No American identification was ever made. And for decades after, people kept claiming to have seen Butch Cassidy very much alive, in Wyoming, in Washington State, in Spokane, working as a mechanic named William Phillips. To this day, nobody has ever definitively proven whether Butch Cassidy died in Bolivia or lived to old age in the American Northwest. That ambiguity is the Wild West's final gift. It refused to give you a clean ending. Back in the United States, the last official outlaw era closed not with a shootout, but with a ceremony. On November 16, 1907, Oklahoma became the 46th state. The Indian Territory, the last great ungoverned stretch of American land, the final refuge for men running from the law, ceased to exist by the stroke of a pen. Marshals like Bass Reeves, who had arrested over 3,000 people in that territory alone, quietly handed their jurisdictions over to state courts and went home, The frontier, legally speaking, was over. What remained was something stranger, a country that had just erased its own wilderness and immediately began to mourn it. Buffalo Bill Cody was already touring his Wild West show across Europe by then, charging audiences to watch a performance of something that no longer existed. The cowboys and sharpshooters in that show were playing characters, performing a past that had been alive just 20 years before. Annie Oakley was still in the show, still splitting playing cards at 30 paces, still drawing the loudest applause of the night. But she was a museum exhibit now, not a warning. The men who had made the West genuinely dangerous, the Jameses, the Youngers, the McCarty boy who called himself Billy the Kid, were all dead or imprisoned or forgotten. Jesse James had been shot in the back of the head by a coward named Bob Ford in a rented house in St. Joseph, Missouri, on April 3, 1882. Pat Garrett, the man who killed Billy the Kid, died himself in 1908, shot in a dispute over a land lease, unmourned, nearly broke. Even the lawmen didn't get the endings the stories promised. Wyatt Earp outlasted all of them, dying in Los Angeles on January 13, 1929, at the age of 80. He had spent his final years consulting on Western films in Hollywood, telling directors how to make gunfights look real. He died in a bed, in a city, with electricity and indoor plumbing, while talkies played in theaters down the street. The last gunfighter became an advisor to men pretending to be gunfighters. That is, perhaps, the truest ending the Wild West ever got. Not smoke and fire, not a last stand, just an old man in a city, remembering something that the whole country had already decided to remember differently. And somewhere, maybe, just maybe, a man named William Phillips was tuning an engine in Spokane, keeping a secret nobody could ever quite prove or disprove. The Wild West didn't end, it just became a story we told ourselves about who we used to be.